Hello, Year 12, me again, and welcome back to your next lesson. So, today we are focusing on Cromwell in Ireland and Scotland, which is also known by some as being the third and the last civil war. So, first of all, we're going to look at Cromwell's actions in Ireland and then his actions in Scotland, and then we're going to think about Cromwell's reputation as a result of what he did, particularly in Ireland, but also in Scotland. So, issues in Ireland in 1649. One of the first things that the English Commonwealth wanted to establish after the execution of Charles was the fact that they had to subdue Ireland, who were rebelling. So we've talked about this before in terms of Ireland geographically and religiously and financially as well. Hundreds of years, many monarchs struggled to keep Ireland in check, very much so because Ireland felt quite detached from England and wanted more independence, particularly as we became more heavily driven by Protestantism, and Ireland remained as a dominant Catholic state. Many monarchs, way before Charles or James, had considered Ireland to be almost a thorn in their side. And as we've seen previously with James and with Charles, they tried in many different ways to get Ireland to fall under their command, some more successfully than others. So now, just because Charles was dead, doesn't mean that Ireland were going to suddenly rally their support behind the Commonwealth. In fact, it was very much the opposite. There was active opposition regarding the imposing of English authority within Ireland. Following the execution of Charles I, the Earl of Ormond, who had been a strong supporter of the Stuarts, had persuaded both Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics to team up together to rally against the English Parliament. So in May 1649, the Rump appointed Cromwell as Lord Lieutenant and commissioned him to crush the Irish. So that's where we're starting with this story. So there's some key bits that I'd quite like you to get down here. Issues within Ireland. Cromwell was sent to do the following: to carry out great work against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish. So you can tell already with the tone in this language that's being used here. It's very strong, it's very emotive. If you refer to someone as being barbarous, they're barbaric, they don't fit, they're outsiders, they are lawless, they need crushing, that kind of thing. And bloodthirsty as well implies that the Irish are not the same as the English, that they are waging war and they deserve to be punished for that. Cromwell spent just 9 months in Ireland, so it was a relatively short period of time, but he did an awful lot whilst he was there. So first of all, you need to know and remember these two places in terms of historical content. Number one is a place called Drogheda. Cromwell captured that in September 1649. His troops massacred, and when we study about Ireland, I should maybe have said this at the start, one of the reasons why his actions in Ireland are so controversial is because a lot of the numbers don't quite add up. So the numbers that Cromwell reported to have been killed are thought now to be much larger than what was recorded in the official documents. So we say here, his troops massacred nearly 3,500, including 2,700 royalist soldiers. That's thought to be much more. All the men in the town with weapons, and probably also civilians, prisoners and priests, were also murdered. And then secondly, the siege of Wexford, that's another area you need to know. In October 1649, again, it's thought that 2,000 Irish soldiers, and perhaps, again, because that's a bit of a rough number, 1,500 civilians were killed. So this period of time really has stuck with Cromwell. It's one of the things that people tend to remember Cromwell so well for, perhaps infamously, is his actions in Ireland. and historians through time have accused Cromwell of being excessively cruel and almost out of character with the way that he behaves in Ireland in comparison to how he behaved in other countries. So why do they accuse him of that? They accuse him of being excessively cruel because he did take part in the slaughtering of many civilians, personally and also ordering that as well. He transported many Irish Catholics as slaves to the West Indies, and also the seizing of Catholic land. Sorry, my emails keep binging. Taking Catholic land and then giving it to Protestant settlers, and then exiling the Irish Catholics to poor lands in the west of Ireland, which meant that a lot of them struggled to farm and starved. So, I can't put this on the PowerPoint because it's too in-depth, so I have emailed this to you. So I would like you to read the information written by John Morel. Normally I would get you to highlight this, but obviously unless you can print it off, you can't. So instead of highlighting it, I'd like you to make note of some of the essential information. So dates, places, statistics. Sorry, I'm very popular today. And really think about the numbers that John Morel gives in terms of the numbers dead, but also the way in which a lot of them died. So I want you to really think about, obviously, this was an uprising, so some will have died in the heat of battle on the battlefield, but many of them didn't die that way, so I want you to make note of that too. Then consider the following argument against Cromwell's actions. Was he justified, or would you argue that actually he does fall into the barbarous category? Did he go above and beyond what was just and what he was actually asked to do? And do you think that we could class Cromwell as a war criminal by looking at the information that you've read? So I want you to pause me now. This is probably going to take you a while. I don't want you to rush this because it is about 3 pages long. So read it carefully, make notes as you go through. If you can print it, fine, then highlight it. But if not, I would like you to make notes as well. Then what I'll do is, normally we would kind of spend a little bit talking this through and kind of asking questions and me sort of picking on people for your opinion, but obviously can't really do that. So instead, I'll get the Word document up so that I can see it, although I think it'll just probably stay on this page. You won't be able to see it, and then I'll kind of go through some bits that I find quite interesting and kind of hash over some of the things that students tend to ask me when we do this lesson. So pause me, give it a read, make some notes, and then come back to me and I'll go over it. Right, okay, so hopefully you've given that a read. It might maybe be more useful now if you have this document up in front of you as I'm going through it now, so you can kind of keep up with me. But as I've said, you won't actually be able to see this on the video because I only can do it for one sort of screen at a time. I can't bring up another document. So you should be able to see at the top that it kind of gives you a little bit of just a general overview about Cromwell in Ireland, and it talks about the fact that his reputation was significantly blackened as a result of what happened in Ireland, particularly depending on different religions. So he is thought of quite harshly in the Catholic community, even still today. I don't know if any of you watch Derry Girls. If you don't watch Derry Girls, watch Derry Girls because it's hilarious. But even they make reference to it in one of the episodes where they're trying to get out of a history exam, and one of them says something about Cromwell being a cracking guy or something like that, and then they all look at this person like they're really odd because they're Catholics. So even still today, Irish Catholic communities very much look at Cromwell as being a criminal for what he did. But you've also got to bear in mind that it does say that some of Cromwell's actions have been obscured by myth and legend. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, the documentations of the populations of these areas and the amount of dead in the area were quite hard to keep. And it's difficult to get a true representation of just how many people Cromwell was responsible for killing. He's certainly responsible for an awful lot of death. I'm certainly not trying to justify his actions here, but some of them were over exaggerated and have kind of become popular myth over time as the years have gone by. People have sort of over-egged Cromwell's role. So that's what makes this topic a little bit difficult to really get a grasp as to just how responsible Cromwell was for the atrocities that happened in Ireland. There definitely were atrocities. This certainly isn't me trying to say that Cromwell can't be held accountable, because he absolutely can. But to what extent he can be held accountable is a slightly different argument. Right, okay. So the start of John Morel's writing, it talks a little bit about something that I mentioned earlier in terms of the historical grievances that we see within Ireland. So Ireland had always been classed as being a rebellious state, one that monarchs struggled to deal with throughout time. It was always more cut off than Wales in particular, but also Scotland. They were seen as, even though they were a part of the kingdom, they were also seen as being different as well. So almost they are like us, but they are foreign too. That's how they were sometimes seen as being quite unruly. So as we saw previously, Charles had sent Thomas Wentworth to crush Ireland. That's where Wentworth gets his nickname Black Tom from. And Wentworth did manage to suppress some of the Irish rebellions over there during the early years of Charles, during the 11-year personal rule, and he did such a good job within Ireland that Charles promoted him to the Earl of Strafford from his good work that he did there. But as we know, as soon as Wentworth was called back to England to help Charles fight the Bishops' Wars in Scotland, Ireland kind of just fell back into some of its old ways now that Wentworth wasn't there to keep it under its thumb. Which meant that by the time that Charles was executed, there was already quite a lot of bitterness, resentment within Ireland as well, a little bit of lawlessness too. So as you can see in the, what paragraph are we on now? I'm on the third paragraph of the moral writing. It says here that over the next 7 years there was warfare throughout Ireland. It was sporadic, but it was vicious. And it also talks here about the sickening acts of English towards the Irish. So it talks here, this bit is always of particular interest when I read this with a class. One British historian says that when they discovered a diary of a soldier that had been sent to Ireland, an anonymous English officer wrote that the way he describes the shootings, the hangings, the lootings, the burnings of particular villages, that a British historian says that it displays similarities to that of the casual cruelty of the SS Einsatzgruppen on the Russian front in 1942. So for those of you that aren't familiar or don't remember studying Nazi Germany and the cruelty of the SS, the SS Einsatzgruppen were a death force, a death squad essentially, that was sent to the Russian front by Hitler, and they took part in mass racial and religious cleansing of areas within the Eastern Front, where they were actively sent to murder en masse. So they wiped out entire villages of those that weren't considered to be a part of the Aryan race. Communists as well fall within that category, and they murdered hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the most brutal ways possible. We're talking mass shootings, making people dig their own graves before they were shot, putting people inside barns and then setting the barns on fire, using gas vans as well was also quite common by the Einsatzgruppen. And this is saying here that when you look at documentations from the English soldiers in Ireland, actually they ring similarities to what we see the SS doing in World War II. That's how brutal they were behaving. And although it needs to be considered that there were acts of brutality on both sides, the very worst of the atrocities were definitely perpetuated by the English against the Irish. So if you keep going down on the Ormond information, it talks about the fact that after the regicide, after the execution of Charles in January 1649, the island was bitterly divided, and the Earl of Ormond had created an uneasy alliance with Protestant groups and Catholic Confederation groups to try and fight back against parliamentary control. And with that is why Cromwell and his expeditionary force was sent to Ireland to try and establish a firmer footing there. And that is then what led to the atrocities within Ireland. So in quite a relatively short amount of time, we see Cromwell gaining a very, very firm hold of the people within Ireland. So I think in this final paragraph here, let me just try and find it. Can't think where I found it now, where it says about the percentage of areas. Yeah, here. In the next 3 years, over the next 5 years, 3/4 of land held by Irish Catholics was confiscated and redistributed to Protestant Englishmen. And then by the time that Cromwell had left, only 4 major Irish towns remained to be taken. So he certainly carried out a very heavy-duty operation whilst he was there. And then we move on to the information that I really want you to think about, because this is going to help you to consider whether the actions that Cromwell took in Ireland can be considered as just. Is that what he was sent there to do, or did he go above and beyond and act in a cruel manner, in a barbarous way? Can we consider him actually to be a modern day war criminal? So I'm on page 2 of the John Morel information now, where it talks about the storming of Drogheda and Wexford as well, and that they represent a very grim legend, an awful stain on the area and on Cromwell's history as well. It talks here about the 3,000 killed in Drogheda, 2,000 in Wexford. They died from a vast variety of injuries. Artillery bombing, gunshots, swords, dagger, by bludgeon. It's recorded that one man was even killed by his own wooden leg. So a soldier had pulled his wooden leg off and beat him to death with it. But this bit here is the bit that normally tends to bring out a bit of conversation if we were to do this in class. First paragraph on the second page, it says, "Many, perhaps most, were killed in hot blood, but others were killed in cold blood after they had surrendered or been captured. Cromwell ordered none in military or religious orders to be spared." So normally we'd have a little bit of a conversation about the differences between hot and cold blood, but obviously we can't have that discussion, so I'll just go through it a little bit now. Again, this isn't me justifying anybody's murder, because I'm not, but if you were to kill somebody in hot blood, particularly if you were a soldier, that is deemed as being more acceptable. So if you think of it from a perspective, you're in war, you're in the middle of a battle, your adrenaline is racing around your body, everything is happening so fast, it's kill or be killed, and you kill a civilian in hot blood. You can claim, that you weren't within your right mind, you weren't thinking straight, it wasn't logical, you were panicked. With sort of this idea of hot blood as well, it's kind of like a primal feeling going back to our basic instincts of fight or flight. Well, if you're in war, you can't flight, you have to fight. So a lot of soldiers have claimed that they killed people that they probably shouldn't have killed, unarmed people, because it was hot blood. And again, some people would argue that under the rules of war, that's okay. However, we've got quite a lot of documentation to suggest that many people were killed in Ireland in cold blood, and that is very different. If you kill someone in cold blood, that is calculated. You are doing something that you know you shouldn't do. You're not in war. They are not posing an immediate threat to you. So perhaps they are unarmed, perhaps they have surrendered, they might already have been captured, so they might already be in chains. They are no threat to you, yet you choose to kill them still. That's cold blood, so it's different to hot blood. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that actually Cromwell did order many civilians who had already surrendered to be murdered in cold blood, which is where he gets this reputation as being a war criminal. So, for example, there again, we're still on page 2, but if you pop down to the 3rd paragraph now, this is principal evidence against Cromwell comes from his own reports. So this is something that Cromwell wrote himself at the time, and then sent this information to somebody else, and this was then used against Cromwell to say that he had acted unjustly. So Cromwell said, "In the heat of action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town, and I think that night they put to the sword about 2,000 men." Again, he says "I think," so we're quite unsure in terms of accurate numbers. Divers of the officers and soldiers being fled over the bridge into another part of the town, where about 100 of them possessed St. Peter's steeple. So a lot of the men fled because they knew they had lost, and they ran into the church for safety. And he saw about 100 of them run into the church. So Cromwell says, "I ordered the steeple of St. Peter's to be fired." That means he's ordering it to be set on fire. "Where one of them was heard to say in the midst of the flames, 'God damn me, God confound me, I burn, I burn.'" And then later on, he says that they found more Catholics. They found Catholic friars, and he ordered that they were to be knocked on the head. So killed, essentially. So you can see here, these men that have fled, they're running for a reason. They're running because they know that their town has fallen. It's really a step closer towards surrendering, but Cromwell still decided to go that one step further and actually have them burned to death in quite an awful way. And it's thought, if you were still on page 2, but if you pop back up a little bit closer to the top, 2nd paragraph down, why would Cromwell behave this way? Well, if you go back quite a few years and think to the build up to the English Civil War, so we're jumping back quite a way now, if you think about all of the parliamentary propaganda which was encouraged by Pym in the road to civil war, there were so many horror stories of Irish Catholics slaughtering Irish Protestants. I'm sure this, although again, as I've said, this is going back quite a bit now, we watched a part of a documentary. Oh, actually, did it not work? Did I show it to year 13? And then I tried to show it to you and it didn't work. I can't remember. Either or. We might have watched a bit of a documentary that showed some of the drawings that had come from Ireland during that time, which showed Irish Catholics stabbing Protestant babies and murdering women, heavily pregnant women, pushing them into frozen lakes so that they would freeze to death and drown, setting women and children on fire, that kind of thing. So all of this anti-Catholic propaganda that had been relentless for the past 10 years to make Protestants believe that Irish Catholics were collectively responsible for the torture and killing of thousands upon thousands of civilian Protestants had made people like Cromwell perhaps feel that this wasn't just a case of going to Ireland and making them fall in line. No, perhaps maybe it was more than that. Maybe it's a little bit of revenge as well for what's been going on for the past 10 years or so. So he was ordered to go to Ireland and make them fall in line and make them follow the commands of the new Commonwealth. But a lot of evidence suggests that Cromwell and his officers chose to make it more than that. Perhaps maybe so much so that they took it upon themselves to carry out some sort of racial cleansing, like earlier when it said that some of their actions were similar to SS officers in World War II. Perhaps maybe that's what he felt that he should do whilst he was there. So again, still on page 2, towards the bottom in the last 2 paragraphs, it talks about his relentless killing. Same again, burning people alive who had taken refuge in the Tower of St. Peter's Church. If someone's taken refuge, they've essentially surrendered. And Cromwell is still choosing to murder them. It talks quite a few times of the word quarter, the promise of quarter. That is basically just another word for surrender, giving yield, you give up. If you give quarter, that means, you're putting your hands in the air, it's over. Cromwell had reportedly ordered that even if people had given quarter, that they were still to be murdered. It says further down at the bottom as well, right at the end of page 2, the case against Cromwell is that he behaved in Ireland radically different from how he behaved in Britain. So we haven't got to this bit yet, you're doing this bit next. But once Cromwell's done in Ireland, he's then sent to Scotland to put down similar rebellions. And the way he behaves in Scotland is completely different to the way he behaves in Ireland. And he quite clearly says so, by his own admission, that his thoughts and his feelings and his actions towards the Scots are different than they are towards the Irish, which again might perhaps show that Cromwell was excessively brutal, and he even maybe knows that he was excessively brutal. The death rates were very different as well. So when you are comparing military engagements in England, there was usually between a 5 and 10 death percentage. Whereas if you look at Drogheda and Wexford, the percentage of deaths, including civilian deaths, are around about 80% mark. So it's considerably higher. By Cromwell's own admission, these included non-combatants, so civilians, and he knew that they were civilians, but he still decided to go ahead and kill them, including those that had surrendered on quarter and gave up. He still used violence against them. And finally, on page 3, it does give a counter-argument for this. So the case for defence. So when you're considering if Cromwell was excessively brutal or not, and whether we can consider his actions in Ireland comparable to that of war criminals, we also have to consider the time period in which Cromwell was coming from here. Cromwell did act in accordance to a well-established military code of practice. He did not break, again, we're thinking about it from their time period, not our time period. He did not break the rules of war. He acted in full accordance to the laws of war during that time. So it talks in the second paragraph down about granting quarter to those that had laid down their arms, and it says the tradition in Ireland was to deny quarter even when it had been promised. Cromwell cannot be called a war criminal in those circumstances. Immediately after Drogheda, Cromwell summoned Dundalk to surrender, and when it did, his troops did not kill them. But if we look at the military orders within Ireland, and quite a lot of the leaders in Ireland as well, they did not give quarter, so they refused to surrender. And if, again, thinking of it from their perspective, even if someone is unarmed, but they refuse to surrender according to those rules of law of war, they're allowed to be killed. Obviously, it doesn't make it right, but technically, on paper, Cromwell cannot be classed as a war criminal from his time period. And then it kind of just gives a little bit of a summary indeed, talks about the massacres as they are known now, the massacres of Drogheda and Wexford, atrocities committed both in hot and cold blood, and the fact that actually it's still quite difficult to establish to what extent Cromwell can be blamed for what had happened there. And even though there's no denying that it was brutal and absolutely horrendous, whether Cromwell can be held excessively accountable for that or not is still quite a grey area, because that is what he was sent there to do, essentially. Okay, so next thing I want you to do is get out your little textbook for me, please, or use your knowledge organiser. So if you're using your little textbook, it's page 156, or if you're using your knowledge organiser, it looks like this. This is the page you're wanting, with the little cartoon in the bottom of Cromwell, although he doesn't have a face, I don't know why. And you read in the boxes about Scotland. So if you use it on your knowledge organiser, you read in this box here, Cromwell in Scotland, and this little box here, Charles II. But if you're not using your knowledge organiser and you're using your small textbook instead, you want in page 156. And then I want you to answer these questions in full for me, please. So write out the answers for me. Why did Scotland rebel against the Commonwealth? How did Cromwell react? How did the uprising end? And similarities and difference between Cromwell's campaign in Scotland in comparison to Cromwell's campaign in Ireland. So pause me now. Right, okay, hopefully you've managed to answer all of those questions. So just as a little bit of a review of Cromwell and his campaign in Scotland. When Cromwell returned from Ireland in May 1650, he was then sent almost immediately to Scotland. He defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar in September 1650, and then finally crushed the Royalist army at the Battle of Worcester in September 1651. The Parliamentary Army destroyed Dundee within Scotland, killing 2,000 of the inhabitants there. Again, with the word inhabitants, that obviously suggests that a lot of them were not military men, they were civilians. And then, of those that survived, they transported many Scottish prisoners as slaves to the West Indies, which is similar to what we had seen in Ireland as well. So, last thing that I want you to do is, I've tried to make this as big as possible, so I hope you can see it. Using source B and your own knowledge, to what extent do you agree with the assertion that Cromwell was excessively brutal in Ireland? So, this is a letter by Cromwell to the Speaker of the Commons in September 1649, the writings and speeches of Oliver Cromwell. And this talks about some of his actions that he committed in Ireland. We talked a little bit about one of them earlier in St. Peter's church steeple. So I'll read this out to you, and then if you can, just a short summary paragraph using this source and the own knowledge that you've gathered throughout the course of this lesson. Would you agree that Cromwell was excessively brutal in Ireland, or was he just carrying out orders? Was he just doing what he was sent there to do? So Cromwell says, "The enemy retreated into the mill mount. Our men, getting up to them, were ordered by me to put them all to the sword. And indeed, being in the heat of action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms. About 100 of them possessed St. Peter's church steeple. These being summoned to yield, refused, whereupon I ordered St. Peter's church to be fired. When they submitted, their officers were knocked on the head, and every 10th man of the soldiers were killed. This is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the infusion of blood for the future." So a little summary. Using this source and your own knowledge, would you agree that Cromwell was excessively brutal in Ireland? And that's it from me. Thank you for listening.